In the summer of 2012, the worst drought in Kansas since the 1930s came to Barton County and burned the hay crop off every unirrigated field in the county except one. The one was Clara Dunbar's native grass meadow, on the low ground in the southwest corner of her farm. 80 acres of big bluestem, switchgrass, side oats, grama, and Indian grass that her grandfather Earl had been managing without plowing since before Clara was born. The meadow had been there, unbroken, since before Earl's father homesteaded the farm in 1904. The root system under it had been building since before anyone in the Dunbar family had any claim on that ground at all. By the second week of August 2012, Darrel Opp's alfalfa stand to the south was dead. His improved variety fescue and orchard grass was dead. The hay ground up and down the county road was burnt brown and dormant, and in some cases beyond dormant, drought killed, meaning it would not come back when the rain eventually returned. Darrel was looking at buying hay through the winter from somewhere other than his own fields for the first time in 30 years of farming. Clara's meadow was green, not lush. It was not a normal production year. The native grasses had gone into summer dormancy the way they do in dry years, slowing their top growth to conserve moisture. But they were not dead. They were not even close to dead, because the roots of big bluestem in an undisturbed stand go 5 to 6 feet into the Kansas soil, and whatever the drought was doing to the top 12 inches of soil profile, it was not reaching the water the meadow's root system had access to at 5 feet. Darrel drove to Clara's farm in the second week of August. She found him at the meadow fence line when she came out of the barn at 7 in the morning. He was looking at the meadow the way you look at something that contradicts what you believe to be true, quietly, without wanting to have gotten there. "Clara," he said. "Darrel." He said, "I need hay." He paused. "I know what you have in there." He looked at the meadow. "What do you want for it?" Clara said. "I have a second cutting worth of standing grass." She looked at the meadow. "I'll sell you 50 round bales after the cut." She paused. "Same price as the co-op board is listing custom hay at this week." Darrel said, "That's fair." Clara said, "I know it is." They stood at the fence for a moment. Darrel looked at the meadow, at the grass that was green when his alfalfa was dead, that was going to produce a second cutting when his fields were going to produce nothing until the drought broke and recovery seeding could begin. He said, "Your grandfather never plowed this." Clara said, "Never broke it, not in 50 years of managing it." She paused, "And it was there before him." Darrel said, "My father plowed ours in 72. Clara said, "I know." Darrel said, "The alfalfa did better than the native grass in most years." Clara said, "It did." She looked at the meadow. "In most years." He drove home. She went to cut the second cutting. Let me tell you about Earl Dunbar, because you need to understand what he saw in 1959 and why he made the decision he made before you can understand what his granddaughter was still managing 53 years later. Earl had been farming the Barton County ground since 1938, when he bought it from a neighbor's estate. He had grown up watching the Dust Bowl take the topsoil off cultivated Kansas ground and had developed a specific and permanent suspicion of recommendations to plow anything that did not need plowing. The native hay meadow in the southwest corner had been producing hay for his cattle since he bought the place. It produced less per acre than a managed alfalfa stand would have. It required different management, no fertilizer applications, managed grazing pressure, periodic selective burning to maintain the species mix. But it was there. It produced. And Earl had watched it survive the drought years of the 1940s and the 1950s with a resilience that his cultivated hay ground did not show. In 1959, the Barton County Extension agent, a young man named Halverson, who had just come from the state extension office with the latest research on improved hay varieties, had visited the Dunbar farm and walked the 80-acre meadow. He had run the comparison numbers. Native grass mix at typical Kansas production, 1.8 to 2.2 tons per acre per year. Improved alfalfa varieties at typical Kansas production, 4 to 5 tons per acre per year. The improvement was real. The numbers were accurate. Halverson had presented the case for conversion with the enthusiasm of someone who believes in what he is recommending. He had said, "Mr. Dunbar, you are leaving 2.5 tons per acre on the table every year. You keep this in native grass." Earl had listened to the full presentation. Then he had taken Halverson to the meadow and had him watch, while Earl dug a root profile at the edge of the stand. He had dug down 3 feet with a spade, then used a soil probe to go deeper, then gotten down on his knees and pulled the root material from the probe hole and laid it out on the soil surface. Big bluestem root at 6 feet. Not a fine hair root, a substantial root the size of a pencil in diameter, still actively growing, reaching into the soil moisture that sat below the Kansas drought line. He had said, "Do you know how long it takes to build a root system like this?" Halverson had looked at the root. He said, "That species takes a long time to mature, yes." Earl had said, "The grass above ground produces what you measured, 1.8 to 2.2 tons per acre." He looked at the root. The root below is why this meadow was green in 1954, when every alfalfa stand in the county was brown. He paused. You do not replace a root system like this with an alfalfa seeding. You lose it, and you spend the next 40 years finding out what you lost. He had told Halverson, "The grass above ground is the yield. The roots below are the farm. The farm is not for sale." He had not planted alfalfa. He had managed the native meadow for another 15 years, until his son took over the farm in 1974. And he had passed the meadow management notes to his son the same way the notes from the meadow had come to Earl from his own father, in a composition notebook, updated each fall with the year's observations on stand density and species composition and the specific management decisions made that year. Earl's son had passed it to Clara in 1991 with the same instruction Earl had given him. Walk the meadow every spring. Push your boot heel into the root mat. Count the species. What you see above ground tells you what you harvested. What you feel below ground tells you what you have. Clara had walked the meadow every spring for 21 years before the summer of 2012. Let me tell you about the 2 paths, because they ran alongside each other on the same county road in Barton County for 40 years, and the difference between them is not visible in most years. Darrel's father had made a reasonable decision in 1972. Alfalfa at 4 to 5 tons per acre against native grass at 2 tons per acre. The math favored alfalfa substantially, and the extension office was recommending conversion across the county. He had plowed the native meadow, seeded alfalfa, and watched his hay production nearly double in the first cutting year. The decision was correct in the year it was made and in most of the years that followed. But alfalfa roots go approximately 2 to 3 feet into Kansas soil in a well-established stand. They access the topsoil moisture profile efficiently. In a normal year, this is enough. Kansas receives adequate rainfall to keep the top 2 to 3 feet of soil adequately moist for alfalfa through the growing season. In a drought year like 2012, when the top 2 to 3 feet of soil profile is depleted by July, alfalfa has nowhere to go. It goes dormant. If the drought is severe enough and long enough, it dies. Big bluestem roots at 5 to 6 feet access a completely different water table. The water at 5 feet in a Kansas drought year is not the same water that was in the top 12 inches in June. It is water that infiltrated the soil slowly over years, held in the subsoil matrix, not subject to the same evaporative loss that the surface moisture experiences. A plant that can reach that water in August can survive a Kansas drought that kills everything rooted in the top 2 feet. The native meadow had been reaching that water since before Earl Dunbar was born. In a normal year, Darrel's alfalfa produced approximately 380 tons of hay from his converted meadow ground. Clara's native stand produced approximately 170 tons from her 80 acres. Less per acre, less total, sold at the same market price. The efficiency advantage of conversion was real, and it showed in Darrel's operation in every normal year for 40 years. In the summer of 2012, Darrel's alfalfa produced nothing. Clara's meadow produced a first cutting of approximately 90 tons in June before the drought hit, and a second cutting of approximately 55 tons in August when she sold Darrel his 50 bales. In a year, when the county hay market price doubled because supply collapsed, Clara's second cutting hay sold at $240 per ton, nearly 3 times its normal price. Her total 2012 hay revenue, first cutting at normal price plus second cutting at drought price, approximately $43,000 in hay revenue in a year when most of her neighbors in the hay business had zero. Darrel's hay revenue in 2012, zero from his own fields, plus the cost of purchased hay to feed his cattle through the winter. Let me pause here and tell you something about what a native grass root system actually is, because the 6-foot depth figure is not the whole story, and the whole story is worth knowing. A big bluestem plant in an undisturbed stand does not simply have roots at 6 feet. It has roots at 6 feet and 5 feet and 4 feet and 3 feet and 2 feet and 1 foot and every depth in between. The root mass of a mature big bluestem plant in unbroken Kansas prairie soil accounts for 60 to 70% of the plant's total biomass. The majority of what the plant is exists underground. Above the surface, you see the grass. Below it, you see the farm. This root system does several things simultaneously. It holds soil against erosion. It cycles nutrients from deep in the profile back to the surface as the roots die and decompose. It channels water downward through the root channels during rain events, storing it in the subsoil where surface evaporation cannot reach it. And in a drought, it accesses that stored subsoil water on behalf of the plant above. When Earl dug the root profile in 1959 and showed Halverson the 6-foot root, he was not just showing him a plant that was hard to replace. He was showing him a water storage and retrieval system that had been operating continuously for a century, and that had been built in an inch at a time, year at a time process that no seeding program could replicate. You can seed alfalfa on that ground and have a hay stand in 3 years. You cannot seed native prairie and have a century-old root system in any timeline. Once broken, it is gone for any practical agricultural planning horizon. Earl had understood this in 1959 from watching the 1954 drought. Clara had confirmed it in 2012. Let me tell you about the conversation at the fence line in September 2012, because it is where the two paths come together. Darrel had bought his 50 bales in August. He had bought an additional 30 bales in September when it became clear the drought was not breaking in time for him to rely on his own fields for winter feeding. Clara had cut a third cutting in September. Modest, 35 tons, the native grasses giving what they could in the dry conditions, and Darrel had taken most of it. In September, after the third cutting was baled and hauled, Darrel had come back to the meadow fence line. Not to buy hay, just to look. He had stood at the fence for a while. Clara had come out and stood beside him. He said, "My father plowed this in '72. Clara said, "Yes." He said, "He got 40 years of better production out of that ground in normal years." He paused. The math worked in his favor for 40 years. Clara said, "It did." He said, "And then it didn't." Clara said, "And then it didn't." Darrel was quiet for a moment. He pushed his boot heel into the soil on his side of the fence. The dry, dusty, rootless surface of his alfalfa ground that had died in July. The soil gave easily under his heel, powdery and loose, the surface structure broken down from the heat and the dryness. He looked at Clara's side of the fence where the meadow soil surface was firm under the root mat, even at the end of the driest summer in Kansas since the 1930s. He said, "What would it take to restore the native grass on my ground?" Clara said, 40 years. She looked at his field. "Maybe 30 if you start immediately with the right seed mix and the right management." He paused. "The root system you have now at 2 to 3 feet will not be at 5 feet in any timeline you or I will farm." Darrel said, "So I restore what I can, and I accept that I am planting for whoever comes after me." Clara said, "That is exactly right." She looked at the meadow. She said, "My grandfather planted for me. He had no idea in 1959 what 2012 was going to look like. He just understood that a root system you cannot rebuild in a human lifetime is worth more than the yield difference in the years when the rain comes." Darrel was quiet. He looked at Clara's meadow, still showing the specific green of native grass that has found its water at depth even in a Kansas August. He said, "How do I start?" Clara opened the composition notebook she had brought to the fence line. She found the page where Earl had written the Meadow Management Protocol in the winter of 1959 to 1960, the species selection, the seeding rates, the first-year management, the burn schedule. She opened to that page. She said, "It starts here." She handed him the notebook. He read for a while. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if your family has native ground that never got plowed. Tell me if there are big bluestem roots at 5 feet under it. Darrel started the native grass restoration on the converted meadow ground the following spring. He seeded a native species mix in March of 2013. He managed the first year according to Earl's protocols in the composition notebook. He did not expect a full native root system in his lifetime. He expected to give his own children or grandchildren 30 years of better drought resilience than he had in 2012. Clara walked the Dunbar Meadow in the spring of 2013 as she had walked it every spring since 1991. The stand was recovering from the drought. The root mat was intact. She could feel it under her boot heel, the specific firm resistance of a root system that has been there longer than any person on the farm has been alive. The big blue stem was coming back from its deep roots, putting up new growth from a foundation that the 2012 drought had not reached. She counted the species. She wrote the count in the composition notebook. She noted the stand density. She noted her assessment of the root mat condition. She noted the management decisions she would make that year. Then she closed the notebook and walked back to the farmhouse. The meadow was doing what it had been doing since before Earl Dunbar's father homesteaded the ground in 1904. Growing down more than it grew up, building what it could not build fast and would not let anyone take from it in a season, keeping the farm's water where surface conditions could not touch it. Earl had said, "The grass above ground is the yield. The roots below are the farm." The yield had come and gone and come again for 53 years of Clara's family owning that ground. The roots had just been building. Subscribe to the Honest Farmer. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. The 6-foot root is not a curiosity or an agricultural statistic. It is 50 years of slow accumulation that cannot be replicated by any seeding program, bought at any price, or grown in any time frame that a farming family plans in. It is either there or it is not. Either someone protected it or someone plowed it. Earl Dunbar protected it. He said once, "You do not replace a root system like this. It took 50 years to build. It had taken 100 years to build when he said it in 1959. Clara was standing above it in 2012. The roots were at 6 feet. The drought did not reach 6 feet. The meadow was green. Let me tell you about what it meant for Earl to walk that meadow in 1959 and decide not to plow it, because the decision looks obvious in hindsight and was not obvious at the time. In 1959, the Extension Office in Barton County was not recommending alfalfa conversion as a fringe idea. It was the consensus recommendation of the state agricultural extension system based on real research and real performance data from real Kansas farms. The improved varieties were genuinely superior in yield under normal conditions. The conversion numbers Halverson showed Earl, 4 to 5 tons per acre, against the native meadow's 1.8 to 2.2, were accurate. Earl was not refusing a bad recommendation. He was refusing a good recommendation because he understood something that the recommendation did not account for. What he understood was the difference between normal conditions and Kansas conditions. Normal conditions in Kansas, if you look at a 30-year average, include adequate spring and summer rainfall, moderate temperatures, and growing season moisture that keeps the top 2 to 3 feet of soil profile adequately moist from April through August. Under those conditions, alfalfa with its 2 to 3 foot root system performs as advertised. The recommendation was built on those conditions. The recommendation was correct for those conditions. Kansas conditions, if you look at the full historical record rather than the 30-year average, also include drought years that arrive without warning and remove the rainfall that the 2 to 3 foot root system depends on. In those years, not theoretical future years, but real past years that Earl had personally farmed through, the 1954 drought specifically, the 2 to 3 foot root system reaches for water that is not there, and the plant goes dormant or dies. The yield number becomes 0. The extension recommendation had no column for the drought year. It had a column for the normal year. In the normal year, the alfalfa number was better. In the drought year, the alfalfa number was 0, and the native grass number was not 0, and the difference between those two outcomes was not a yield comparison. It was a farm comparison. Earl had farmed through 1954. He had watched the alfalfa operations around him in Barton County go dormant that summer, while his native meadow had kept producing, reduced, stressed, not its best year, but producing. He had watched his neighbors buy hay that summer at drought prices, while his cattle ate from his own meadow. He had made a calculation in 1954 that he confirmed in 1959 when Halverson came with the conversion numbers. The yield advantage of alfalfa in a normal year was real and significant, and it was smaller than the cost of 0 yield in a drought year. Not 0 minus a yield advantage, 0 minus the hay purchases, 0 minus the cattle stress, 0 minus whatever a man loses when his grass operation fails in August and the rain does not come until October. He had dug the root profile not to show Halverson something new. He had dug it to show Halverson something that was not in the research data. The specific depth at which the native grass had placed its investment and what that depth meant when the water table in a Kansas drought retreated below the range of a 2 to 3 foot root system. He had said, "You do not replace a root system like this. It took 50 years to build." He paused. "And it took 10,000 years before that to build the soil the root system is in." Halverson had not had an answer to that. He had driven to the next farm. Let me tell you about the 3 years between Earl's conversation with Halverson and the specific year that confirmed his calculation, because 1959, 1960, and 1961 were not drought years, and the native meadow underperformed the alfalfa stands in those 3 years exactly as Halverson had predicted it would. Earl had watched his neighbors cut 3 cuttings to his 2. He had watched them haul more tons per acre to the barn in September. He had not changed his management. He had walked the meadow in spring, pushed his heel into the root mat, counted the species, and managed within the native grass framework. He had been asked at the co-op in 1961 by a neighboring farmer named Albrecht whether he was still keeping the native grass. Earl had said yes. Albrecht had said, "You're leaving money on the table every cutting." Earl had said, "I'm keeping the table." Albrecht had looked at him. Earl had not explained further. He had gone home and checked the root depth at the meadow edge with a soil probe and recorded what he found in the composition notebook. In 1962, there was a drought. Not the worst drought, not what 2012 would become, but enough. The native meadow produced 1 cutting and held through August in condition that allowed a thin second cut in September. Albrecht's alfalfa went dormant in July. He bought hay in August. He told Earl at the co-op in September that the drought had been unusual and that he expected the alfalfa to recover in the fall. Earl said, "It usually does." He had driven home and written the year's observation in the composition notebook. Native meadow, 2 cuttings, reduced yield, no purchased hay required. Albrecht alfalfa, 1 cutting, dormant July through September, hay purchased at drought price. He did not show the note to Albrecht. He wrote it for whoever would walk the meadow after him and need to understand why the decision had been made. Let me tell you about the composition notebook itself, because it is the object that carries everything in this story, and it deserves the same attention as the root system it documents. Earl had started the notebook in 1947, 2 years before his father had even considered discussing the farm transition. He had started it not because anyone told him to, but because he was the kind of man who believed that observation without record was observation lost. He wrote the spring species count in the notebook. He wrote the cutting dates and the estimated yield by cutting. He wrote the drought assessment in dry years and the flood assessment in wet years. He wrote what he did, which fields he burned when, and what the burn produced in the following spring's stand density. He wrote what he did not do, the years he considered a management change and decided against it, and why. The notebook was not a scientific document. Earl had no formal education past 8th grade and no training in agronomy. But it was a 40-year record of what one man had observed about 180-acre meadow through one specific sequence of Kansas weather events. And that record contained something that no university research station's trial data could contain: the specific history of how this meadow, with these species, on this soil type, with this root system, had performed through this county's specific drought and wet and normal year sequence across 4 decades. When Clara received the notebook in 1991, she received not just a farming instruction, but a weather history and a decision log. She could read what Earl had done in 1954 and what the meadow had produced. She could read what Earl had considered doing in 1963 and why he had decided against it. She could read 40 years of spring species counts and understand how the stand density had changed under Earl's management and what that change had meant for yield. She walked the meadow every spring because Earl had walked it every spring, and because the spring walk produced the data that went in the notebook, and because the notebook was the argument for why the meadow existed and why it existed the way it did. Without the notebook, the meadow was just old grass that an old man had never gotten around to plowing. With the notebook, it was a managed asset with a documented performance history across 40 years of Kansas weather. In August of 2012, when Darrel came to the fence and asked what she had, Clara could tell him the meadow's performance in every previous drought year in the notebook, going back to 1947. She could tell him what it had produced in 1954, in 1962, in 1974, in 1980, in 1988. She could tell him that in none of those drought years had the meadow required purchased hay, and in none of those drought years had it produced 0. That was not one data point. It was 65 years of drought performance across 6 significant dry events. The meadow had never failed in a drought. Darrel's alfalfa had been performing better than the meadow in every one of the years between those droughts. That was also true, also documented, also in the notebook, in the comparison data Clara kept. The meadow had never been the best performer in a normal year. It had never needed to be. It needed to be the best performer in the years the normal years were not, and it had been every time. Let me tell you one more thing about the 2 paths and what they cost across the full 40-year span, because this is the honest accounting, and the honest accounting is what the story requires. In the 40 years from 1972 to 2012, Darrel's converted alfalfa produced approximately 6,200 tons of hay, from his former native meadow ground. At an average hay price across that period of roughly $80 per ton, the gross revenue was approximately $496,000. The input costs, seed, fertilizer, cutting, and baling labor, equipment costs, ran approximately $60 per acre per year on the converted ground. On 80 acres for 40 years, that was $192,000 in inputs. Net revenue from the conversion across 40 years, approximately $304,000. Clara's native meadow produced approximately 3,800 tons across the same 40 years, substantially less, exactly as Halverson had predicted and as Darrel's co-op comment in 2008 had confirmed. At the same average prices, gross revenue was approximately $304,000. Input costs on native meadow management were approximately $15 per acre per year. Burning, minimal management, no fertilizer, no reseeding. On 80 acres for 40 years, that was $48,000 in inputs. Net revenue from the meadow across 40 years, approximately $256,000. The conversion had produced $48,000 more in net revenue across the 40 years before 2012. Darrel's father had been right about the economics in most years. In 2012 alone, Darrel's revenue from the converted ground was zero. His hay purchase cost to feed his cattle through the winter was approximately $38,000. Clara's revenue from the meadow in 2012 was $43,000 at drought prices. Her hay purchase cost was zero. The single drought year swung the 40-year comparison by $81,000 in Clara's direction. A 40-year advantage of $48,000 for the conversion became a net advantage of $33,000 for the meadow in a single summer, and the meadow was still there in 2013. The root system was still at 6 feet. The 2012 drought had not touched it. The next drought year, whenever it came, would find the same 6-foot roots finding the same subsoil water. Darrel's converted ground, if he spent the next 30 years restoring the native grass, would never again have the root system it had before 1972. The accounting across the next 60 years would run differently than the last 40. Let me tell you about what Darrel found when he dropped a soil probe into his former native meadow ground in the spring of 2013, before he seeded the restoration, because it is the last concrete piece of the story, and it completes the picture. He had called Clara before he did it. He had said, "I want to check the root depth before I seed. I want to know what I actually have down there after 40 years of alfalfa." Clara had come over. They had taken the soil probe to the southwest corner of the former meadow ground, the corner farthest from the old fence line, the corner that had been under alfalfa the longest. Darrel had driven the probe to 2 feet. They pulled it and looked at the root material. Alfalfa roots, white and fine, exactly as the agronomists described for a well-established stand. 2 to 2.5 feet, consistent with the literature. He had driven the probe to 4 feet. They pulled it. Some fine root material, residual organic matter from the years of alfalfa decomposition, the soil structure better than he had expected, because the alfalfa had at least maintained some biological activity at depth. But nothing like what Clara's meadow showed at 4 feet. No substantial root mass, no evidence of the water access that the native roots would have provided. He had driven the probe to 6 feet. They pulled it. Almost nothing. some fine organic matter. The soil was still soil. It had not degraded structurally in 40 years of alfalfa, but the living root mass at 6 feet was absent. Whatever had been there before 1972 was gone. Clara had looked at the probe material. She had not said anything. She had gone to the fence line and run her probe into the Dunbar meadow ground at 6 feet. She had pulled it and held the root material alongside Darrel's probe material from the same depth. The comparison did not need explaining. One side, dark root mass, living, at the depth where the 2012 drought had not reached. The other side, trace material, residual, at a depth that had not seen living native roots for 40 years. Darrel had looked at the two probe samples for a long time. Then he had said, 30 years. Clara had said, at least, and the roots you grow in 30 years will not be the roots that were here in 1972. Those were 100 years old when your father plowed them. Darrel had nodded. He had put the probe in the truck. He had seeded the native grass mix the following week from the protocol in Earl's 1959 notebook. He was planting for his grandchildren. He knew it. Earl had planted for Clara and had known that too.